It's 10 o'clock. This is Sky News at 10, our top story.
Is this the end, Mr Johnson? Have you run out of road?
The former Prime Minister accused of deliberately and repeatedly misleading Parliament over Partygate. Boris Johnson branded the report a political assassination as a date is confirmed for the by-election to replace him. Also tonight. Hold no hate. The message to thousands after victims' families observe a minute's silence in Nottingham. At least 40 children among hundreds feared dead after an overcrowded fishing boat capsized, with the Greek Coast Guard close by. Our net zero targets are creating a winter energy gap, with coal power no longer a viable option. Plus,
any queen who could be gulled by such a pretty, wicked fellow and take him to her bed and put a crown upon his head does not inspire fear. She inspires pity.
From Hollywood to Westminster, tributes to Oscar-winning actress turned Labour MP Glenda Jackson, who's died aged 87. And we'll take a first look at tomorrow's front pages. That's in the press preview from 10:30. Hello there, a very good evening. He has become the figurehead of the Conservative civil war. Today, a parliamentary inquiry concluded Boris Johnson deliberately misled Parliament over Partygate again and again. The scathing report from the Privileges Committee found that Downing Street staff regularly broke COVID rules and engaged in a pantomime to stop their behaviour becoming public. But the former Prime Minister described the findings as deranged and lies. And with a divisive Commons vote next week and a tricky by-election in his former constituency next month, his disruptive influence will continue to rattle the government. Sky's political editor Beth Rigby reports.
Is this the end, Mr Johnson?
Once a Prime Minister, now out of office, out of Parliament and, for now, out of political road. After a 14-month investigation, finally time for the verdict. Did Boris Johnson mislead Parliament over Partygate? A unanimous yes from the Privileges Committee, its report damning of Boris Johnson's conduct and character, accusing him of having deliberately misled the House of Commons and the committee investigating him, impugning their work, undermining the democratic process, while being complicit in the campaign of abuse and attempted intimidation of the committee. Enough to recommend a suspension of 90 days if he were still an MP, far exceeding the period needed to trigger a by-election, and a recommendation that his parliamentary member's pass be withdrawn.
Boris Johnson is not only a lawbreaker but a liar. He's not fit for public office and he's disgraced himself and continues to act like a, pound-shot Trump in the way in which he tries to discredit anybody who criticises his actions when actually a decent public servant would have done the honourable thing, would have had a little bit of humility and would have apologised.
An apology, the last thing on Mr Johnson's mind, instead pure anger. The committee now says that I deliberately misled the House, and at the moment I spoke I was consciously concealing from the House my knowledge of illicit events. This is rubbish. It is a lie. He went on to say, this report is a charade. I was wrong to believe in the committee or its good faith. The terrible truth is that it is not I who has twisted the truth to suit my purposes. It is Harriet Harman and her committee. This is a dreadful day for MPs and for democracy. MPs in here agreeing with him, but for very different reasons.
Boris Johnson lied. He lied to MPs, he lied to the people of this country, he lied to nurses, doctors, care workers, bus drivers, everyone.
MPs will vote on Monday to pass their judgment. The leader of the House clear. Members will decide free from party pressure.
It will be a painful process and a sad process for all of us, the task that we face on Monday. But all of us must do what we think is right, and others must leave us alone to do so.
You have the whole of the opposition against him, but you also have the Boris haters in the Conservative Party.
This, one of Boris Johnson's biggest allies, confident he'll lose the vote, but also sure this is not the end. Is he too damaged from this? Can he come back? Will he come back?
It depends on the judgment people come to. I think many people will look at 90 days and will think that that is simply too harsh, too aggressive, and shows what the committee was really trying to do. I think this will generate sympathy for him, but he is still a popular national figure. He still has a connection with voters that most politicians would give their eye teeth for.
This PM struggling in the polls and struggling with his former boss on an immigration visit this morning, far away from Westminster, but not the drama engulfing his party. And what a drama it's been. 3 separate Partygate investigations that resulted in police fines, the resignation of Boris Johnson as PM and now his departure as an MP. It has been a psychodrama that has distracted and disrupted the Conservative Party and the government. And while the report is now concluded, the investigations are over, the fallout continues with a party now divided, by-elections on the way, and a frenzy around what Boris Johnson might do next. Boris Johnson dominated here after his 2019 triumph. Now ejected from Parliament, disgraced, he nevertheless looms large, keeping his options open and casting a shadow over his successor still. Beth Rigby, Sky News in Westminster.
Beth Rigby there. Well, it took 14 months to complete and in the end ran to 108 pages and 30,000 words. Its conclusion and recommended censure tougher even than Boris Johnson's harshest critics had expected. Our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, has been poring through the committee's findings.
Again and again, Boris Johnson told the public and Parliament that in here they followed the rules. But his investigators were told by a Number 10 insider just how untrue that was.
Parties and end-of-week gatherings all continued as normal. This was all part of a wider culture of not adhering to any rules. Number 10 was like an island oasis of normality.
Damning testimony about the culture inside Boris Johnson's Downing Street, revealed by a junior Number 10 official blowing the whistle to this committee. They said that even though they set the rules for the rest of the country, they were slow to be enforced inside Number 10. The only nod to the rules was a warning to be mindful of the cameras on the way out. It was all, they said, a pantomime.
This, the most notorious example of that culture. Boris Johnson in November 2020, during a lockdown, surrounded by alcohol. The committee not buying his explanation.
Even now, after the publication of this report, Boris Johnson maintained that he had to go to leaving dues in Number 10 to boost morale. But the committee disagrees. They say that the COVID rules and guidance at the time did not allow a socially undistanced event to proceed purely for the purposes of maintaining staff morale. And this would have been clear to Mr Johnson.
It was a pattern of behaviour, the report says. The then Prime Minister standing in the Commons making statements he must have known were false.
All guidance was followed completely during Number 10. Whatever happened, the guidance was followed and the rules were followed at all times. I believe that the events in question were within the guidance and were within the rules. I came to this House and said, in all sincerity, that the rules and guidance had been followed at all times.
That was 4 of the 8 times the committee thought that Boris Johnson had misled Parliament. And after trawling through mountains of evidence, this is the crux of the argument that they reached at the end. They say they found it highly unlikely that the former Prime Minister could have believed the assertions he made to the Commons at the time that he was making them. Many aspects of Mr Johnson's defence are not credible. Taken together, they form sufficient basis for a conclusion that he intended to mislead.
Deliberate deception, combined with a campaign of intimidation against the committee, leaving this former Prime Minister facing an unprecedented punishment. Sam Coates, Sky News.
Let's head to Westminster. Join our political editor, Beth Rigby. So, Beth, a vote in the Commons next week, a by-election next month. Boris Johnson's influence will be felt, but can he still make a political comeback, do you think?
Well, Jonathan, I think the first thing to say is this is certainly the closing act on a drama that began back with Brexit in 2019 that saw Boris Johnson win the Conservative leadership to go on and win that landslide in the 2019 election and then him become unstuck, ending tonight with him out of Parliament and really heavily sanctioned by fellow MPs. I think the big question is this genuinely the final act, or is there another sequel? And I have to say, the jury is out. When you listen to what Boris Johnson himself has said, he said it's farewell to Parliament for now. A very close ally of his tonight said to me about the vote on Monday that the vote to remove his parliamentary pass would be wiped if he was re-elected. That, to me, quite a bullish statement of this being a politician that might fancy another tilt at that place when some time has passed. I think in the short term, the vote on Monday will be a litmus test on Boris Johnson. You might remember that back in October last year, he was planning potentially another tilt at the leadership. He said he had up to 100 MPs backing him, but made way for Rishi Sunak when he realised that there was a huge chunk of the parliamentary party that simply wouldn't tolerate his return. How much of that base does he still retain? Even his most ardent supporters telling me tonight they think most MPs will abstain. But if you're politically Boris Johnson, you don't want to feel your balloon has entirely deflated. He wants to see a show of strength in the Commons, I think, for him on Monday. And I think it will give us a sense of the momentum or not behind Boris Johnson. But I think that even though he has left this place, he still isn't going anywhere. As you said, we've got the by-elections. But beyond that, will he be throwing rocks in from the sidelines, criticising Rishi Sunak's government and policies, saying that he is not honouring the manifesto on which Boris Johnson won that huge majority? Will he spend some time building his base back with the grassroots? I think the big picture here is that Parliament has decided the fate of Boris Johnson for now. But this is a politician that has always gone to the public. And the big question here is, what do the grassroots of the Conservative Party think? What will the public make of this over time? And does he still have the appetite to come back? The vote is on Monday. It's his 59th birthday. He's still a young man. He still has political ambition, and the big question and the big unknown is, will Boris Johnson try and can he come back?
OK, Beth, for now, many thanks. Hold no hate, the message today from the mother of Barnaby Webber as new details emerged about the man suspected of killing him and two others in Nottingham. Detectives have been given a further 36 hours to question the 31-year-old suspect, who is a former Nottingham University student. Caterina Vitozzi reports.
A city in shock and united in grief. Today, Nottingham stood still. Some silent, many crying. Here, alongside three families now devastated after Tuesday's attacks.
It feels like he's touched a lot of hearts over the years, more than what we assumed and knew that he had.
We stand here and we feel your love, and we're united in grief and shock and disbelief. And one day we will smile again, but it will take time.
It just is truly so unfair. Be kind to each other, look after each other. Don't have hate in your hearts. Say prayers for my baby girl.
Today, Nottinghamshire Police revealed that the 31-year-old suspect is a former student at the University of Nottingham. It's the same university where Grace O'Malley-Kumar and Barnaby Webber had just finished their first year of study. Now, police don't believe that link is a motive in these attacks, and they say they're keeping an open mind as to what the motive could be. But there is now a detailed timeline of what happened. Police say the attack on Grace and Barnaby happened here just after 4 a.m. They believe the suspect then walked to and tried to enter a supported living complex. At the time, police weren't called. Ian Coates' body, the 65-year-old caretaker, was found nearby. Police say the suspect stole his van and used it to hit another man here and attempted to run over 2 others at this location. Police say by this point, a marked police car was in pursuit. At 5:30 a.m, 90 minutes after the first attack, police detained the suspect with a taser after the vehicle had stopped. Today, friends of Ian Coates shared their memories of him with us. The school caretaker was a lifelong keen angler who helped troubled kids like Ben Dutton when he was 13 by introducing him to the sport that he loved.
He set up a fishing club and we all used to do it after school, and he taught us the basics in the classroom. An unselfless man, literally, just gave everything to them kids so that they had a chance to do something or just had a little bit of something in their lives. And that was Ian all over.
Today, as police confirmed they've asked for extra time to question the suspect, more flowers arrived to remember the victims. Some left by strangers, others by those close and heartbroken by what happened here. Catherine Overtotsi, Sky News, Nottingham.
To Greece now, where 3 days of mourning have been declared as fears grow that hundreds of migrants, including children, have drowned in an overcrowded fishing boat while trying to reach Europe. The ship carrying the migrants reportedly set off from the Libyan port city of Tobruk around 5 days ago, apparently aiming to reach Italy. At 11 a.m. Greek time on June the 13th, authorities were told a large boat carrying around 750 migrants was travelling in international waters. First contact with the ship is made around 3 hours later, but the ship's crew said they didn't need help. The Greek Coast Guard then shadowed the vessel throughout the day. Someone from the boat contacted the Nautical Distress Hotline that evening and provided the ship's coordinates. Shortly after that, another distress call from the boat. This time, the caller said the vessel was moving from side to side. The Greek Coast Guard continued to observe the ship into the night, but in the early hours of yesterday morning, it sank. Our Middle East correspondent, Alistair Bunkle, reports from Kalamata, where the survivors were brought to shore.
The search operation is continuing, but the weather is turning and storms are forecast. The ship that brought the dead ashore is back in port, and the survivors are being looked after in a nearby warehouse. All of them, so far, are men, aged between 15 and 45.
No one is sure exactly how many people were on board. Everyone knows, though, it was a lot.
These people said about 700 or 75.
775.
Yes, but I think his boat is small for this number. I think it's 500 in this boat or 550.
Some of the survivors are being treated in a local hospital, and there is now confirmation that women and children were on board. All the women are dead, says this survivor. The women and children are dead because they were sleeping in one room. They were staying in the room, so it's impossible that they didn't drown. Relatives of the missing have come to Greece to try and find their loved ones. Aftab Khan is from the UK. His cousins were travelling from Pakistan.
You're searching for your relatives?
Yeah, we're searching for relatives. Yeah.
How many relatives are you missing?
There's 3 relatives are missing. We found 1 relative and he's alive, and we're not sure where the rest of them are.
And how are they connected to you?
My cousins.
There are questions why the Greek Coast Guard didn't intervene when they first realised that the boat was carrying migrants and dangerously overcrowded. They say that the boat was in international waters and that they were operating to international laws.
It's getting close to 48 hours since the shipwreck and no new survivors have been found. Add to that the fact that it capsized and sank in one of the deepest parts of the Mediterranean Sea, and we might never know how many people lost their lives on Tuesday night.
Nevertheless, the search goes on, and Greece is in a 3-day period of national mourning for the victims. For all the calls to prevent a repeat disaster, there will be more this summer, almost certainly. Alistair Bunkle, Sky News, in Kalamata in southern Greece.
It's one of the challenges of trying to reach net zero. How do you keep the lights on during a cold, still winter when the UK's coal plants are being mothballed? Well, today, the National Grid insisted it was in talks to extend the life of 2 coal units to provide emergency power later this year. But one industry source has told Sky News that's unlikely to happen, as our climate change correspondent Hannah Thomas-Peter reports.
Coal-fired power stations, polluting relics of the UK's industrial past. These days, they generate a tiny percentage of the country's electricity. But the National Grid, which is charged with keeping the lights on, likes to have some on standby to help prevent blackouts when it's very cold and wind power generation is low.
We've been looking at the risk associated with Russia's continued invasion of Ukraine. One of the things that the Secretary of State has asked us to do is to talk to the coal units that we used in a similar manner last winter to see whether we could secure their availability for this winter.
But it seems that might not be so simple. Here's the picture last winter when the National Grid had 5 coal units on emergency standby. 2 here at EDF's West Burton-A in Nottinghamshire, 1 here at Uniper's Ratcliffe on Soar Power Station nearby, and 2 at Drax in Yorkshire. Between them, these coal units were warmed a number of times just in case, and actually used once during the cold snap in March. But this winter, things are looking much less certain. West Burton-A has closed as planned. It's far too old to stay open. Ratcliffe is going to be used for routine commercial power generation and therefore isn't available for emergencies. And now it appears that Drax, the only real remaining option, is very unlikely to be able to help. In a statement, a spokesperson told Sky News, "As we announced in April, we have closed our coal units at Drax and have started the decommissioning process. Since then, we have had various discussions with government and the National Grid electricity system operator, but we are not in negotiations to extend their availability into the coming winter." The grid says it has plenty of other tools at its disposal to help balance the system. It is likely to keep using its demand flexibility scheme, which pays consumers to use less at times of peak demand. But some believe the rush to phase out coal completely by October next year is a mistake.
We've had situations where there's been low wind output in the summer. It's not just a case that we need these contingencies in the winter. We need all year round to have the tools to manage different weather patterns as the weather becomes more important to the amount of generation that we can produce.
An example of the complexities and challenges involved as the UK continues its transition to clean power. Hannah Thomas-Peter, Sky News.
The mother of Alfie Steele and her partner will spend decades behind bars for the killing and torture of the 9-year-old. Alfie was beaten, held down in a cold bath and suffered 50 separate injuries. Carla Scott will spend 27 years in prison for manslaughter and child cruelty, while Dirk Howell was sentenced to life and will serve at least 32 years. England captain Ben Stokes says he's confident he'll be able to bowl in the Ashes series against Australia. Stokes is recovering from a knee injury but bowled in the final training session today. All players will wear black armbands and hold a moment's silence at Edgbaston for the victims of the attacks in Nottingham.
Yeah, last 3 days have been really good for my confidence. I've bowled every day so far and been able to sort of run in with more intensity day by day. So I've got myself in a real good place to be able to bowl. But David Sakers obviously came in and he mentioned something to me last week down in Scotland saying if you're still bowling by the 4th and 5th test, then we've done something right.
The grieving families of 2 people killed when ticketless fans rushed to get into a concert at the Brixton Academy in South London have blamed greed and a lack of safety measures for their deaths. Rebecca Icomelo and Gabby Hutchinson died days after being seriously injured in the crush last December. A criminal investigation is still underway, as Matthew Thompson reports.
This is the moment that an ordinary night out turned into tragedy. As fans queue to get into the Brixton O2 Academy, there's a sudden surge in the crowd. The crush left 33-year-old Rebecca Icomelo and 23-year-old Gabby Hutchinson dead, and another woman seriously injured. 6 months on, their families are still reeling.
She's got 2 young kids,
They are missing their mom. They don't really know what actually happened to their mom, you know, so they really want justice.
But to get that justice, first the families need answers.
You might not think it's you, but that's why we want everyone to come forward that does know anything, because it could be your family next. You know, we watch things on TV and you just think that will never happen to us, and we're now sitting here in that situation.
Questions have been raised about security and ticketing procedures at the venue on the night. The police have made it clear that they're considering charges of corporate and criminal negligence manslaughter.
Since December's tragedy, the doors of this iconic venue have remained shut. Lambeth Council has suspended its licence. The police have called for that licence to be revoked. That would spell the end of 40 years of live music here.
But in the last few months, a campaign has sprung up to save the O2 Academy, supported by major acts like Blur and The Prodigy.
We have to consider how important this iconic venue is in terms of the UK cultural economy, and also over and above that, the importance of the learnings that we can take from it so that we don't have these incidents happen.
Lessons may one day be learned from the tragedy that unfolded here. But before that, there must be answers. Matthew Thompson, Sky News.
Now, from Hollywood to Westminster, Glenda Jackson was today remembered as a formidable politician and one of our greatest movie actresses. Over a career spanning several decades, she played queens, kings and a woman struggling with dementia, but eschewed the trappings of luxury. And as a Labour MP, she was a fierce critic of the war in Iraq and the policies of Margaret Thatcher. Sky's Katie Spencer takes a look back at her life.
Oscar winner Glenda Jackson receives yet again another award.
Her talent lit up the stage and screen. In the film that won her first Oscar, Oliver Reed famously described acting alongside Glenda Jackson as being run over by a truck. Her performances were fearless.
Oh, I don't want to torture you. Just say you love me.
Born in Birkenhead, after winning a scholarship to RADA, she came to the attention of the Royal Shakespeare Company. And while she never looked back, she never forgot her working-class roots.
The driving force, having actually gone into wanting to be an actress, was getting a job. But to actually have a job meant that you could eat.
As her contemporaries traded off their sex appeal, on stage or screen, Jackson brought a unique intensity. It was real. Playing the Virgin Queen in 1971, she was, by this stage, a household name.
Don't you remember me, Glenda?
But she didn't take herself too seriously.
Look, if you want to take your wife to the theatre, please do. Just don't give me any...
She won a second Oscar starring opposite George Segal in romantic comedy A Touch of Class. The stellar roles kept coming.
At the height of her success, having worked consistently into her 50s, came a massive handbrake turn as she decided her future lay on a different stage.
Politics. Elected in 1992, devoting 23 years to representing Hampstead and Kilburn as a Labour MP. Outspoken on the Iraq War, universal credit, and when Margaret Thatcher died, summing up the former Prime Minister's legacy as
Greed, selfishness, no care for the weaker, sharp elbows, sharp knees.
There was an edge to everything she did. And once she'd sorted out what she thought, she would land her punch whenever she wanted to in the Chamber of the House of Commons.
When she retired from Westminster in 2015, she returned to where she'd left off. At the age of 82, playing one of Shakespeare's most challenging parts, King Lear, to 5-star reviews.
Elizabeth is missing, I know it.
Winning awards for her acting as recently as 2020. Unafraid to speak her mind, with her fearless dismissal of the pretensions of Hollywood, Glenda Jackson was a one-off. A phenomenal talent on whichever stage she chose to grace. Katie Spencer, Sky News.
The remarkable life of Glenda Jackson. And that was Sky News at 10. Coming up, we're going to take a first look at tomorrow's papers in the press preview, including this story. It's on the front of the Eye. Their headline, he lied and lied and lied. And tonight I'll be joined by contributing editor at Novara Media, Moya Lothian-McLean, and chief executive at the Total Politics Group, Mark Wallace. Do join us in a couple of minutes. Hello, time for the press preview then. It's our first look at what is on tomorrow's front pages and having a look at the headlines with us tonight, contributing editor at Novara Media, Moya Lothian-McLean, and the chief executive at the Total Politics Group, Mark Wallace. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. A very good evening to both of you. We'll chat in a moment after we've had a look at those front pages, beginning with the Eye, which leads on the Privileges Committee report, into Boris Johnson saying he lied and lied and lied. Meanwhile, the Metro asks if his alleged lies to Parliament are career-ending. The FT says he's been condemned in a damning report. While The Guardian focuses on that 90-day suspension the committee recommended for Boris Johnson had he still been a Member of Parliament. Here's the Daily Mail. It says Tory MPs and grassroots activists have been left furious by the Partygate report. The Telegraph also focuses on the response of Boris Johnson's allies' response to the report, saying they will oust the MPs who vote for his censure. The Daily Express describes the committee's findings as the most spiteful stitch-up in the history of politics. And no holds barred from the Daily Star, which depicts Boris Johnson as Pinocchio. And don't forget, you can scan that QR code that you see on screen during the programme, and you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us discussing them. And tonight, we're joined by Moya Lothian-McLean and Mark Wallace. Great to see you both on this rather warm and humid evening. And it's interesting looking at the front pages because they are very split. We've got the Mail saying it's vindictive, while the Eye says he lied and lied and lied. Mark, we knew this report would be damning, but it was scathing, wasn't it?
Absolutely, very much so. I've got to say, Jonathan, somehow every time we review the papers together, something massive seems to happen. You know, to have a quiet night of news. Yes, the report was absolutely scathing. It didn't pull any punches, and a lot of the evidence that went with it, including from unnamed special advisors, other people around Downing Street, added yet more quite shocking detail that, frankly, I don't think tomorrow's newspapers are going to have quite enough space to go through and pick over all the details from it. We'll see several more days of fallout from the report alone. Clearly, the MPs on that committee, I think, were not calmed in their response by the way Boris Johnson had conducted himself with regard to the inquiry. And we're hearing a lot of, bile and fury from the former Prime Minister and from his most enthusiastic and devoted supporters. But ultimately, it comes down, when you look at a report like this, in terms of the original behaviour and then the lies to try and excuse and divert and direct from it, he only really has himself to blame. If Boris Johnson had been whiter than white as he ought to, as part of the price of getting to run the country, by following everything that he and his own government had set out, and then if stuff had gone wrong, if he put his hands up to it, he wouldn't be in this position. But he is, and ultimately, a spiteful, angry tone to a report, as his allies are alleging, doesn't change the material that it found.
Yeah, but Mark, he says it was cock-up rather than conspiracy, doesn't he? And he says that this is all a vendetta.
Well, he says that it's a vendetta. There's a slight degree of, he would say that, wouldn't he, to quote someone else involved in a different scandal some decades ago. But the fact is that this report doesn't say mistakes were made. We've all heard 1,001 reports from different arms of the British state over the years that says mistakes were made, lessons will be learned. It says that there were lies, and that is a fundamentally different thing. That's about knowing untruth, not mistakes of omission or just overlooking things. The fact is that everyone watching this show tonight will remember what those rules were like. We can remember their force and then the vital importance of them. We can remember when they got absurd, and things like the snacks and debates over the Scotch egg counted as a substantial meal in a pub and all that kind of stuff. The fact is that people around the country went through an awful lot in that dreadful period, and understandably they're furious when they find out people who were setting the rules, who were making rules, were breaking rules.
Yeah, Moya, we're looking ahead to Monday. There's going to be a vote in the House. The front page of the Metro, which seems to be on a run of good headlines at the moment, is Proper Whopper a career stopper? What's your verdict on this whole affair? And do you think that Boris Johnson's political career is over now?
Well, I think good headlines are in the eye of the beholder. It definitely rhymes. I don't know if Boris Johnson's career is over. You'd think that something like this would be so big, so damning that no one can ever come back from it. But if you look at the history of British government, plenty of people have recovered their careers in some manner or other, whether that is within Parliament or without. You look at, say, the Chilcot inquiry. After that, you thought that Tony Blair and Alastair Campbell would probably never be on frontline politics again in the same manner, but they still have careers. Boris Johnson made over £1 million last year in speaking fees alone. He might not be back in the Commons as an MP, but that doesn't mean that he won't continue to profit from his long 18 years within Parliament, or whether he will still be involved in politics in some manner as a statesman who gives his opinions. I think that we have a very short-term memory when it comes to disgraced politicians in this country.
And Moya, what about the verdict of the committee, a 90-day suspension, if he'd still been an MP, of course, but he resigned. Do you think that is fair? Some are arguing it's perhaps overreaching.
Well, that 90-day suspension was actually imposed because of Boris Johnson's premature response to the committee's confidential letter that they sent him last week saying, look, this is what we've decided. It was going to be a 20-day suspension, but because Boris Johnson decided to jump the gun, resign, not take the suspension in case it triggered a by-election, you'd have to leave in what he saw as, I guess, a losing to the committee's rulings. Instead, he decided to jump before he was pushed. And because of that, and because of what he said in that letter that he released when he said he was resigning with immediate effect, they increased the suspension to 90 days. It's rather, bolting the barn door after the horse has already gone. But they gave very clear, articulate reasons for why they'd increased the suspension, because of this campaign that they called of abuse that they said Boris Johnson had been complicit in. And there also might be a follow-up report that is coming, this was threatened by the Privileges Committee, about that abuse and the campaigning on the behalf of Boris Johnson's allies that sought to undermine the credibility of the Privileges Committees and those that sat upon it, so that the verdict, when it was delivered on Boris Johnson, would not be taken as seriously and, as we've seen, would be surrounded by this miasma of conspiracy.
OK, well, let's have a look at the front page of the Daily Mail. We can imagine their take. The headline, Tory revolt over vindictive bid to banish Boris. Where does all this leave, Mark, the grassroots Conservatives, many of whom are still big fans of Boris Johnson, and indeed the public?
Well, I think it's possible to kind of over-egg the idea of there may well be a Tory revolt, as the Mail says. I'm sceptical that there'll be a civil war, as some commentators have been saying. I think if you see in parliamentary terms, I think Boris Johnson hasn't managed to hold together his support base on the green benches in the House of Commons anywhere near as strongly as he might have liked. In the grassroots, he has from the evidence I've seen, a minority, but sizable minority of people who are still very enthusiastic about him, who are very annoyed about this. I've got to say, actually, touching on what Moya just said, this format of a committee investigating, a committee potentially a committee of other MPs deciding whether a punishment should pass a boundary that potentially triggers a by-election, I think is a less than ideal one. I think it does leave the road open for there to be dispute and allegations of personal bias and so on. Back in the coalition years, the Tories were elected in 2010 promising there would be what's called a recall power, the idea that voters would get to choose if enough voters in a constituency in a short enough time signed a petition or similar, they'd be able to trigger a by-election. That was watered down with the Lib Dems in the coalition agreement, and the Conservatives agreed to water it down. Zach Goldsmith, actually a Boris Johnson ally, was the person proposing the kind of full-fat recall that would put this in the hand of voters. It was watered down that produced this committee fudge, and I think we can see that it's a less than ideal route because it crosses over whether people are being partisan or whether political or personal dislikes coming into it. That leaves it open, these kind of arguments. I'm also quite uncomfortable with the idea the committee should start disciplining people who criticise the committee. I think if you're going to have a system like this, you do need to stop somewhere. You can't have a kind of approach in which you start saying you should be punished for criticising the way in which the committee goes about things. we might like its conclusions or not, but parliamentarians should be free to decide that, and voters should decide who sits in Parliament.
Yeah, interesting point. And Moya, before we move on to our next story, our political editor Beth Rigby said tonight that the vote on Monday will be a litmus test, really, for Boris Johnson and his standing now. Would you agree with that?
I mean, obviously. I just want to come back on the point that Mark made. While I totally agree that there always should be more power put within the grassroots rather than just MPs, we should have a full functioning democracy. What's interesting about this committee and the, allegations that they say were abusive towards them is that throughout this process, Boris Johnson and his allies have been claiming that this is a kangaroo court. They said this is a witch hunt. They've been using all this very inflammatory language. 4 of the 7 MPs on that committee are Brexiteers. It is a Tory-laden committee. And it was one that was put together when Boris Johnson was still Prime Minister. He had the opportunity to whip the MPs to make sure that Harriet Harman, who has been the focus of a lot of these attacks and accusations of bias, was not the head of that committee. That didn't happen at the time. There's criticism, and there's what the allies of Boris Johnson and Boris Johnson have been doing, which is why it has led to this verdict that there's been a campaign to undermine the credibility of this committee. And I would say that has been accurate. What happens now and whether there should be further action taken, it seems a bit ridiculous if we get to the report on a report on a report about who did what. But there's no denying that there has been a concerted effort to make the committee look like it was biased in a way that it simply wasn't.
OK, listen, we're going to move on because we're heading towards the break, and I want to just touch on the front of The Guardian and this awful story today. It's on the right of the Guardian about this sinking of a migrant vessel. Mark feared that 500 hopes fade for 500 still feared missing. I mean, this is a real tragedy.
Absolutely horrendous news about which we're still learning yet more. As you say, that Guardian report covers a gentleman who's flown to Greece in search of his wife, who he believes was on this ship, and he is left with no news, no information, no clarity on what appears to be one of the worst maritime disasters of recent years. And again, it seems people being put in deadly peril and dying at the hands of completely ruthless people smuggling gangs.
Yeah, Moya, women and children as well believed to be on board.
Yeah, there's early reports are saying that at least 100 children were in the hole. And what this will come down to, as we've seen time and time again, is also not just looking at the people smuggling gangs, but looking at the authorities that were involved or not involved in the rescue process. There's already been conflicting reports about authorities not coming to help when they were asked, and the authorities in Greece are saying no, that people refused help. What we've seen in the past with the disaster that happened in the Channel is there is a long-term back and forth before any families or victims or survivors get answers about what really happened. And that's going to be an even more torturous process for those who are left.
Yeah, just desperate, isn't it? OK, both, thank you for the moment. We'll speak again shortly. Coming up after the break, the Metro and other papers have the latest from Nottingham. A huge vigil was held this evening following the attacks, which left 3 people dead. Discussing that and more in a moment.
Me and my ex-partner were trying to have a child for almost 18 months. And then we realised that, I had some fertility problems. So she had gone first to go and get herself checked, and then I followed suit, and then it came out that I was the one with the problem.
And you were young?
Yes, we started when I was 31. Yeah, I'm now 33. I had something called undescending testicles, which I felt like as if it was a problem, and that was when I was that was at the age of 11. And then we moved on from there, and then we just went through this rigorous and series of tests, trying to get to the end conclusion as to why I haven't got any sperm. In the end, I did get sperm. They were able to retrieve sperm, but they were just looking as to, why it never happened for me naturally. So yeah, it was very, very challenging.
Yeah, and what impact did it have on you mentally?
Oh, it was extremely difficult for me to kind of process as to why I don't have any sperm, and trying to navigate myself in this journey of wanted to have a baby with my partner, and make things were challenging for our relationship, and so it was tough. But I always said to myself that even if it doesn't happen for me, there's a purpose for my life for me to kind of spread awareness around this important subject.
Yeah, so in about a third of cases where couples are struggling to conceive, there is a male factor. Sometimes it could be quite extreme, as we just heard from Jonathan, where there's no sperm being produced. But it's very important that at an early stage of failing to conceive, that the man also has a sperm test to try and understand, is there an issue there? And if there is a problem with his sperm, then there are further tests that can be done to try and understand why there's a problem. Generally, being healthier, this is true for men and women, will improve fertility. So trying to normalise your weight. Obviously, there's increasing levels of obesity, so trying to normalise weight is important. Moderate amounts of alcohol and caffeine. Smoking is bad for sperm and fertility. So trying generally to be healthy, a good healthy diet. But I think, to be fair, for most people, for most men who have problems with their sperm, it's not something that they can just fix by improving their own lifestyle. I think that it does need investigating, and then to see whether there's any medical treatment possible for them.
Hello, welcome back. Moya and Mark are still with us. Part 2 of the press preview. Moya, let's talk about events in Nottingham, because yet again today, close family members of those who died gave remarkable speeches. Their bravery in standing up and addressing the crowds was incredible, and actually also really unusual, isn't it, to see relatives going through this sort of trauma prepared to do something like this?
I would say in more recent years, I've remembered there have been a number of families who've made a point of standing up and saying, like Grace O'Malley Kumar's mother did, please don't have any hate in your hearts, which was a really key emotive line from this. I remember when the London Bridge attacks occurred, then we saw the family of the young man that was killed, Jack. They stood up and said something very, very similar and put out public statements. And I think it is a reflection of the current political climate we live in, and perhaps the speed at which information is circulated across social media. You get all these tidbits about the person who is alleged to have attacked these young people, and Ian Coates, who was also killed in Nottingham, and you get a lot of speculation immediately. None of this is helpful for families who are grieving, but also the pursuit of justice for their lost ones. And we have seen it more frequently. I was saying in recent years that families have come out and said, please don't jump to conclusions, please don't say this, please don't say that, please don't have hate. That's not what our lost, loved ones believed in. And they made some absolutely devastating speeches. Barnaby Webber's mother talking about the fact that she didn't know what he was doing during history, perhaps because he wanted to be a pilot, and perhaps it was he wanted to fly Spitfires. It's those small little details that just really remind you of what is gone. It's tragic on every level. Yeah, Mark, 2 youngsters clearly loving life, and a school caretaker who was described today as selfless.
Yes, 2 people at the very start of their lives now, adventures in the world, and one gentleman who so many tributes from the community that he was part of as to how much he had dedicated his life to helping people. And I've got to say, I'm in awe of families who at this moment of dreadful trauma can have the bravery and strength to speak out publicly in the way they did. God forbid I doubt that I would have the strength to be able to do that in their circumstance. I do hope that we don't come to expect this as being a kind of thing which should automatically be expected of people. These evidently are families who've made an incredibly brave decision and have taken this moment to give a gift of their advice and their message to that community, which I think is hugely admirable.
Yeah, it really is. And let's finish with the front of the Daily Telegraph. More a fabulous picture there of Glenda Jackson, Oscar-winning actress, of course, former Labour MP. And it's been really interesting hearing today about her life and really being reminded of two fantastic careers.
Yeah, God, wasn't she a powerhouse? She won 2 Academy Awards, didn't bother going and picking up either of them. They ended up as bookends in her mother's house, she said. And she served 23 years as a Labour MP after she'd won Oscar, Tony, Emmy. And she was one of the most articulate performers that we had in the House of Commons. And it really shows in the tributes. You have papers like the Telegraph and the Daily Mail who would, you know, you'd think normally would be opposed to someone like Glenda Jackson, who was a committed socialist. But no, they are staying there and they're paying tribute. I think that shows the absolute command and legacy that she has and the respect that she garnered for her long and illustrious career fighting for people's rights.
Yeah, and Mark, when we hear about MPs' egos, as we do quite a lot, she is one who appeared not to have an ego. She didn't even bother going to pick up her 2 Oscars.
And dare I say, you even hear that actors often have egos as well. But so she managed the double whammy of defying expectations on that front. But it's also a reminder about how important it is that we have people we should have people in Parliament, both Houses of Parliament, from a really wide range of perspectives and expertise. And it's totally valid for there to be young MPs as well as MPs who are late in their lives. I'm not someone who signs up so you must have done a certain number of decades of something else. But it's great to have Parliament leavened and improved by such a range of different backgrounds, and hers was one of the most unique. And she was the star of Morecambe and Wise, which we shouldn't forget.
No, it's been great watching that clip again today, hasn't it? Mark Moyer, thank you very much. Mark and Moyer will be staying with us for the next hour to discuss tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Right now, let's take a look at the weather.